Hello, and welcome to a debate show without an interesting name, hosted by Atheist Analysis. My name is Brian Ross. I will be the moderator for tonight's debate. And the topic of tonight's debate is going to be, is the Old Testament's laws treatment of slavery and rape unethical? Discussing tonight's question is Cash, the host of Atheist on Air, the explicit, honest, humorous, heathen podcast. He is making the case that the Old Testament law is unethical in regards to slavery and rape. Debating him tonight will be Max Mills, the host of ADSWAIN and a regular with Atheist Analysis debates. Tonight's format is going to be both debaters will have 12 minutes to make their opening arguments, followed by 8 minutes of rebuttals and follow-ups. After that, we will have 10 minutes of question and answer time, where both debaters will have the opportunity to pose their own questions and subsequently respond to them. After that, each debater will have 5 minutes to make any closing remarks they may have. Cash, whenever you are ready, you will have 12 minutes to make your opening remarks.
Well, thank you. I'm ready. And I thank y'all for inviting me. This is exciting to me. I love debate. I may not like it after tonight, but I love debate in general. In what could be the shortest debate ever, my formidable opponent chose this topic. Does the Old Testament law take an unethical stance on slavery and rape? In my ignorance, I agreed, and it wasn't until a friend of mine, Michael Goff, pointed out the difference between morality and ethics. Prepared for a debate with someone I assumed was going to attempt to defend the immoral act of biblical slavery and biblical rape, I felt confident in my knowledge. I was even more confident in the fact that the evidence provided by the one true religion's holy scriptures would be overwhelmingly in my favor. Not only is slavery and rape condoned, both receive laws and commands of the appropriate ways God wishes it to be administered. Furthermore, the kinder, gentler God 2.0 goes further and commands that slaves obey their masters. No admonishments are given, only conditions for which these vile and atrocious acts are to be managed. I now understand that ethics are governed only within a particular time and place, which would render this debate useless. The debate would require me redefine the word ethics before I could even begin, not something I could do honestly, and nor is it something I desire to do. Regardless, their immorality, the ethics of the time period, negate them being unethical. If instead, had the Bronze Age, semi-literate, ignorant desert sheep diddlers found one to enjoy the occasional slab of bacon, or didn't feel obligated to count their women among the sheep, or felt that the possession of another human being was immoral, then these acts of sanity would have been considered unethical for the time period. And then and only then could I debate the ethics. So really we have but two options. Either my opponent agrees to rephrase the debate replacing the word unethical with immoral, or I will concede, stating that yes, according to the definition of ethics, the immoral scum whose words, edicts, and commands are written in the Bible were ethical within that specific time and place, and that Max, my opponent, was simply attempting either to bait me to debate, hoping that I would not recognize the carefully chosen debate wording. I don't think that's the case. This would be similar to me asking a group of Christians, how many of each animal did Moses put on the ark? And when the eager respondents replied with 2, I could proudly boast my intellectual prowess by saying, no, you dumb fucks, Moses didn't have an ark. Noah did. If my opponent agrees to changing the wording for the debate and wishes to proceed, I will step back and confidently and continue on. I wish to forewarn Max and the listeners that you please not misinterpret my passion and zeal with anger. My sarcasm is not an attempt to hurt you or anyone else on a personal level, and it is as much as a part of me and my rantings as the sound of my voice. And I would ask that you not take offense when it's deployed. Many are gifted with wit and wisdom, the latter of which I was spared while getting a double dose of the prior. I don't know how effective a debate on whether slavery and rape was immoral in the Bible would be. Max is well aware of the problems that plague his holy book, and his only weapons to defend such horror is to invite the opposition into a world of mental gymnastics, a world of word salad games, basically, which are common among those attempting to defend the indefensible. It's simple, it's logical, and it's rational for me to say, in what possible condition would it ever be moral to own another human being? When would it ever be okay to rape another person? The majority will exclaim, it's not and it's never. This is not a fallacy of ad populum where I appeal to the masses. This is an argument for sanity and the appeal to rational thinking. Only the most deluded would attempt to defend slavery and rape. And you will find that it is only a characteristic and product of the religious and the religions. Only the religious will defend the child molesters, and only the most religious zealots will defend rape and slavery. Regardless the ethics, regardless the time period, rape and slavery are cruel, immoral acts. One can attempt the mental gymnastic defenses with the Latin and Greek or even the writings from ancient Hebrew texts, but that is not what we're working from or with. We are working from Bibles, modern-day Bibles. No matter the version or king-endorsed version, they all include the same edicts, examples, and encouragements of the most heinous acts humanity has ever witnessed, and I am baffled by how many attempt its defense. We can't agree to disagree. This isn't my opinion versus yours. It's fact versus fiction. Defending the Bible, God, and His commands are always transparent attempts to relieve the cognitive dissonance by those whose egos, whose faiths, and whose beliefs are threatened by its very text. I see it as an egregiously dishonest and serves only to secure one's imaginary prizes and rewards in heaven.
Let's get ready to rumble!
Okay. Does that conclude your opening?
That does.
Wow.
I always use the let's get ready to rumble right then when I'm done.
I like that. I actually think that's...
I gotta say, the fireworks have already started to go off. If it's anything like any other fireworks display, and that it's gonna end with quite the finale, I'm sure. Max, you have 12 minutes to make your opening remarks. You can start whenever you're ready.
Well, first, I think there's been some confusion. I would never, ever say that rape or slavery are okay under any circumstances. I think that those things are evil. So we're on the same page. My argument will not involve that. As for what my argument actually is, I actually have a PowerPoint. It's a little fancy. All right. Is the Old Testament law stance on rape and slavery unethical? No. That's the title. So before we get too far into this, Cash probably thinks I'm going the direction he thinks that he said that I was going, but it'll be a little different. I want to remind you guys that this text is ancient, and a lot of my arguments will center around the fact that in my religion, Christianity, the Old Testament law is not applied for 2,000 years, and that in both Judaism and Christianity, it was never applied as objective morality to those outside of Judaism. It is a law that was intended as a covenant with a specific nation during a specific time period. Even in Judaism, the destruction of ancient Israel and its ethical system and temple harmed their ability to practice Old Testament law. Whether these laws would be ethical to implement today is not necessarily indicative of whether they were ethical at the time. And remember, we are discussing whether the laws are ethical, not whether rape or slavery are unethical, because rape and slavery are unethical. So here, I'm not going to read all of this, but it is my support of that claim that Christianity does not consider us to be bound by Old Testament law, unless Cash has an issue with that basic Christian doctrine. I'm just going to go ahead and move forward. With that in mind, let's talk about rape. Many critics of the Old Testament like to claim that it promotes or condones rape. As I am about to demonstrate, nothing could be further from the truth. In order to demonstrate this, I will need to provide the historical cultural framework we are dealing with here. This is the story of Amnon and Tamar. Now, if you read it, what basically happens is Amnon walks up to his half-sister Tamar and is like, yo, hey, let's get it on. I'm going to rape you. And she's like, no, hey, please don't do that. Marry me first. I don't want to be raped. Which is very confusing because Tamar's about to be raped by a sibling and her reaction is to beg him to marry her instead. Because in this culture, a woman's hope for a future is dependent on her ability to find a husband. That's not necessarily good, but it is how the things were back then. A man would not want to marry a woman who is not a virgin, even through rape. These are the inalienable facts of the time period. You've probably guessed which verse I'm going to use this for, so let's jump into it. If a man meets a virgin who is not betrothed and seizes her and lies with her, and they are found, then the man who lay with her shall give to the father of the young woman 50 shekels of silver, and she shall be his wife, because he has violated her. He may not divorce her all of his days. So there are some important parts of the text that I want to examine, which is that nothing in this text is a command for the woman to do anything. These are all things the rapist must do. He must give her back part of what was taken from her, a future, presumably if she desires it. There's nothing in the text indicating that she and her father have no say in the matter. The interpretation that the woman must marry the rapist is simply not in the text. Here, the rapist is made to give something to the victim, and there's no reason to believe the victim could not refuse, and the rapist loses something important. She can still divorce him for all the reasons women could divorce men in Old Testament society, a failure to care for and provide for her needs, basically, but he can never divorce her even if she completely neglects his needs. She has all the rights of a wife, but he has no rights of a husband. In this day and age, this is a big dang deal. And the fact that she retains the rights to divorce in those cases, and he does not, gives her the power and rebuts the interpretation that she has no choice. So more from Deuteronomy 22. If there is a betrothed virgin, and a man meets her in the city and lies with her, then you shall bring them both out to the gate of the city, and you shall stone them to death with stones. The young woman because she did not cry for help when she was in the city, and the man because he violated his neighbor's wife. You shall purge the evil from your midst. But if in open country a man meets a young woman who is betrothed, and the man seizes her and lies with her, then only the man who lay with her shall die. But you shall do nothing to the young woman. She has committed no offense punishable by death. For this case, all right, you guys can read it. All right, calm down. Here we have two passages, two cases of sex happening between a man and a woman. In one case, it is explicitly rape. In this case, the rapist is executed and the victim is not. In the other case, it is not rape, or at least presumed to be not rape because she did not struggle or cry out, which I am not defending as a general policy. But the wording of the text is not that she was raped, it was that they had sex. In order to explain in greater detail what went down, let's dive into another part of Old Testament law. By the mouth of 2 witnesses or 3 witnesses shall the one liable be put to death. He should not be put to death by the mouth of 1 witness. So here's a little bit more on the witness. Part of it is the crime must be proven to have been committed of the culprit's free will and without the aid of others, which means that the woman was in public within range of multiple eyewitnesses who saw her not struggling or resisting, who were willing to attest to it being consensual and can prove that she did it of her own free will. If this cannot be proven, Old Testament law assumes she is innocent. How sure must she be? How sure must the witnesses be in their neutral, so family members and stuff doesn't count testimony? Enough to execute her. The witnesses are the first ones to cast stones against the victim, or against the perpetrator. So, in addition to all the other evidence, the witnesses have to provide enough evidence to prove beyond the shadow of a doubt that this happened non-consensually, or that it happened consensually rather, and be confident enough in their testimony to be the ones who execute the perpetrator. It is extremely tough to kill someone under Old Testament law. As for the ethics of the death penalty in Old Testament law itself, that's kind of a side issue, but I would like to get to it later. One last word on rape. There are some verses in the Old Testament that the modern uneducated mind reads out of context and assumes are rape. These verses typically revolve around taking female virgin prisoners of war for yourself and such. Let's take a quick look at what the Old Testament law actually says about such things. All of this stuff. These women were not raped. They were taken in safe from death and either married or set free to live lives as women of Israel. If married, they had all the rights of women of Israel, including divorce. The Old Testament Hebrews were among the first to condemn marital rape. Here are some ancient rabbis citing scripture and how they reached the conclusion that marital rape is absolutely not okay. The idea that they thought women were objects who could just be raped at will is just absurd. I feel as though we've established with certainty that the ancient Hebrews did not agree with or support rape in any way, and were actually some of the more progressive cultures on that subject for their time period. With that in mind, let's move forward. Divorce. The Old Testament law allows a woman to petition for divorce under a variety of circumstances. There's a wide variety of them listed here, but let's move on. And yes, typically Christians are not huge fans of divorce, but as Jesus said, it was because our hearts were hard that Moses wrote us this law, which fits pretty well with the Hebrews teach about their marrying a prisoner of war law. Here you have Rashi quoting an ancient Talmudic passage, Tanchuma 1, calling the law that allowed people to marry a prisoner of war a law that was intended for the time period to prevent things from getting out of hand. It says basically the same thing, that they would not have followed a harsher law. So they had a lighter law because it was better to have something than nothing. The Old Testament law does permit slavery, and slavery is wrong. But would a law that just demanded all slaves be immediately freed really be the right thing? As Rabbi Tzvi Freeman points out, take an agrarian society surrounded by hostile nations. Go in there and forcefully abolish slavery. The result? War, bloodshed, hatred, prejudice, poverty, and eventually a return to slavery until the underlying conditions change, which is pretty much what happened in the American South when the semi-industrialized North imposed those laws upon the agrarian South. Not a good idea. Better idea, place humane restrictions upon the institution of indentured servitude. Yes, it's still ugly, but in the meantime, you'll teach people compassion and kindness. Educate, make workshops, go whitewater rafting together, all this stuff. Which is pretty much what happened to Jewish society. At a time when Romans had literally thousands of slaves per citizen, even the wealthiest Jews had very modest numbers of servants. And those servants, the Talmud tells us, were treated better by their masters than foreign kings would treat their own subjects. And by the way, although I am quoting Rabbi Tzvi Freeman, I do think it was a good idea to end slavery in the South. Just want to go ahead and say that. So it was because their hearts were hard. The Hebrews were given protective regulations for slaves, giving them basic human rights, because more severe restrictions would have been rejected. This is the message Christ and hundreds of years' worth of rabbis have given regarding laws like this one. And every law regarding slavery given in the Bible was in some way restricting either the number of people who could be enslaved or the severity of harsh treatment that could be given to slaves. It was protective. There's more to say on the slavery topic, like the fact that slavery was often manifesting itself in a positive way if we look at the verses. And I know this sounds crazy, but bear with me for a second. In a desert culture which claims to have originated from nomads, the idea of an actual static jail was difficult, and a lot of people who entered into slavery were criminals. Not all, but a lot. Another example of slavery have a positive influence is the fact that a poor family can sell their daughter as a maid to a wealthier family. Yes, selling your daughter as a maid to a wealthier family until she hit puberty. The verse being discussed is this one from Exodus 21, which does look pretty bad without its historical and textual context. Let's take a look at what some prominent rabbis from back in the day had to say about this. When it says that she should not go free as the slaves go free, what a lot of Hebrews interpreted this as being was she couldn't go free in the situation in which Canaanite slaves go free at the loss of a tooth or an eye. Instead, they stay for 6 years or until the Jubilee year, until she develops signs of initial puberty. Whichever comes first will be the first event to affect her emancipation, and the master will then reimburse her for the value of her eye or for the value of her tooth. So this is not someone being sold into a lifetime of slavery without their consent. There's only one situation in which a person can be sold into slavery without their consent, and that is an inability to make restoration for goods stolen in Exodus 22. Compare that slavery functioned in part, remember that slavery functioned in part as a penal system for the ancient Hebrews. Comparing this form of slavery to American slavery is uneducated, and for its time period the ancient Hebrew laws were extremely progressive. They protected the ancient Hebrew slaves from sexual and physical abuse, ensured they had enough to eat, and generally forbade their mistreatment. There are some other controversial verses about slaveries in the Old Testament, so let's bang some of those out real fast. If his master gives him a wife, and she bears him sons or daughters, and the women and her children shall belong to her master, and he shall go out alone. Pretty scary verses, and they come after this verse. If he comes in alone, he shall go out alone. If he's a married wife, his wife shall go out with him. The Hebrew suggests that, as the ancient Hebrews said when discussing this law, it is meant here that if he has a wife or children when entering servants, his master may give him a heathen bondmaid. If he has no wife or children, his master may not give him a heathen bondmaid. This isn't a man being deprived of his wife. This is a man who already has a wife and children going into the enslavement, who chooses to stick with a maidservant rather than leaving free with his wife and children. And by the way, despite not being slave, the master has to provide fully for the slave's wife and children as though they were his own household. And here's the verse about the slave dying days later. The way this has historically been interpreted is that if the slave dies afterwards and was beaten prior but not that day, it is assumed that the master is not guilty of murder. If he does die that day, it is guilty of murder. The point here is to give him the benefit of the doubt. The Bible does give him the ability to beat his servant, but if he kills him, he is a murderer, and if he injures him in a permanent way, the slave goes free. It's also worth noting that if a slave wishes to be free, all he has to do is walk out the door. The Old Testament law forbids returning a slave to a master he has run away from, a few verses after this one. Freedom is literally on a slave's doorstep, indicating that if he remains there, it is because he is benefiting because of the support provided to him and his family, support that was not provided outside of Israel.
I'm sorry,
However,
your 12 minutes is up if you would like to finish.
Your 12 minutes is up. I'm good for now.
All right. Well, that was certainly something. Cash, for your first argument, you didn't use nearly all of your time, but I'm sure that you'd like to use all of it to respond to that. So whenever you're ready, your 8 minutes starts.
All right. I don't really know that I need all that time because I argue or I debate, which often turns into arguments, from a logical standpoint. And what I just heard, if I summed all that up, is if I wanted to become a rabbinical apologist for the Torah, that is the stuff that I would use to combat the nonsense and the horror that is in what we have and the debate titled the Bible. Max goes into this long thing, and I mentioned this in my introduction. He pulls the apologist words, these people from these ancient Hebrews, and tries to manipulate, cover up, use the apologist tactics in order to defend the defenseless. As far as indefensible, I don't think you can defend that, and so you have to use works of magic. I'm more familiar, I grew up Mormon, and so I'm more familiar with the Mormon apologetics groups, the farm and fair groups, but it's the same tactics employed. They use the same tactics. Max mentioned earlier that slavery was protected, like it was something. This was awesome type slavery. This was really good slavery, and it was really protected. Kind of like, to me, it brought back the thought of the Catholics and their incessant defense of child molestation with, it's a protected system, and it's a different type of child molestation. It's a better, kinder. These kids wouldn't have made it without us diddling them kind of defense, and I don't like that. I don't like that he twisted that up, because if we're just going to use the Bible, and regardless of which one he wants to use, now obviously the most common Bible on the planet is the KJV, but I understand that it's not even close to accurate, and you shouldn't use it. If you're going to be a Christian apologist, it shouldn't be used, because its armor is thin. So you have to use some of the older texts in order to confuse an opponent or attempt to confuse an opponent. I don't think that, however you want to play this, that you can defend those acts. He brought up a number of scriptures, and I've got just shit tons of notes about it. So as far as we can take those one by one. But if I say something like the woman in the city, Deuteronomy 22, I believe it was, the married woman is raped but doesn't cry out for help, the rapist and the woman shall be killed. Nowhere in there does it go into this huge defense that Max did. Instead, Max is debating with me over some writings and speeches and talks given by Jewish apologists, rabbi apologists, because they have the same issue. They have to defend that Torah, which is a mess. And that Torah makes up the first books of our Bible, the Christian Bible. So I don't think you can use that. I think it's skirting the truth. You're just playing an apologist, and that's not what we came to do. That's all I got, Max. Go ahead.
All right. Once again, you used about half of your allotted time, so
Cool.
Max, whenever you're ready, you have 8 minutes.
I'm the same way in bed.
Okay, so the point that I want to make before I move forward, and I'll be a little bit more specific about this for the rest of my arguments, is that like the defense that I gave is it's true. I didn't just say the verse. It's an interpretation of the text based on the wording. It is, for example, an objective fact that the situation in which the woman is killed is not biblically described as rape. The wording that is used to describe rape in the following verses is not used to describe what is happening here. The Hebrew assumes it is consensual in this context. And all of the other arguments that I made involving the witnesses and involving the court system, a lot of that stuff wasn't rabbinic tradition. A lot of it was stuff taken directly from the Bible with verse references. Like, the Bible is not whatever fundamentalists would like you to believe, the Bible is not a series of chopped up half sentences that we can excerpt and, whip around, at our convenience. It's a legal system is what we're talking about in the Torah. And this legal system has certain laws which work together in ways that make them work better and more ethically than they would as just a standalone text. And so a lot of my thing was that. I'll also point out that with the Talmudic verses I cited, and the Talmud is not, modern Jewish rabbis. These are the ancient guys, not too terribly long after a lot of this stuff was written down to begin with. Like, this is how the people who lived under these laws interpreted and enacted them, which I do think is more relevant than a, 21st century apologist trying to make stuff up. So, and every one I use does contain verses. They're good for summaries and it's good for interpretations, but they also used verses together to draw these conclusions, which were cited in the slideshow. I feel like you're asserting the Bible's unethical thing as kind of self-evident, but you've yet to do a whole lot of actually arguing in favor of the Bible being unethical in this respect. You just assume it's self-evident and make these general accusations about the form that my argument is taking, which isn't really a good way to go about doing business, in my opinion. And for the record, I didn't say slavery was protected. I said slaves were protected. And I've defended that idea that it was ethical for the time period because without these laws, they would have been worse. And with harsher laws, I think they would have been ignored. And I think that's bad. And I think that protections for people who are victims are good. With that in mind, I'm going to use the rest of my time to finish up my... It's almost done, so it shouldn't be too much of a thing, but I want to get it all out there. You can treat non-Hebrew slaves worse than Hebrew slaves, and I think for good reason. Neighboring countries didn't have the same protections the Hebrews did for slaves, so it was better for all involved for them to be in Israel. Loosening up the restrictions made it a better deal to get one, and it got the Hebrews, who otherwise probably wouldn't have wanted a foreigner in the house, to bring them into a country that protected them and forced their masters to support their families and to provide for them. And again, they are purchased as slaves. So, like, this is a step up. It's positive. So the decision we ultimately have to make regarding our judgment of Old Testament law is what is more important, sticking to your principles or getting results and actually rubber meets the road helping people? If the latter, the Hebrew Old Testament law did that and did it excellently. If the former, then you value your personal qualms and emotions over helping other people's lives improve, which kind of makes you a bad person. But I still want to talk about capital punishment because I think it has a lot of relevance to this discussion. How execution in Old Testament law brought an end to execution in Old Testament society. Ancient Judaism had all but condemned the death penalty as early as the 1st century. Despite agreeing with the death penalty in theory, according to the verses that you'll find in Scripture, it has been agreed that humans are too faulty to hand down such a sentence in almost all cases, with the rabbis going as far to say a Sanhedrin, an ancient Jewish court, which puts a man to death once in 7 years is called murderous, or once in 70 years. And then some of them say, had we been in the Sanhedrin, none would ever have been put to death. Many attribute this to the form the death penalty took in ancient Israel, mostly stoning. And in addition to what I said earlier about it being extremely difficult to execute someone, the witnesses had to cast the first stone, followed by all the men and women in the community. It makes me wonder how our modern society would fare if death penalty was carried out by our own hands, and whether it would change our perspective on the issue. It did change the perspective of the Hebrews, and in that way, a law which seems barbaric at face value created a very positive change. The Old Testament era treatment of capital punishment became more humane and rarer than the one in the modern-day U.S., and unlike our laws, it served the purpose of putting an end to the practice. Similarly, and due largely to thinking derived from Old Testament law, we see many Jews fighting against slavery and other things people like to pretend the Old Testament supports. The Old Testament is a practical response to evils in the culture it was addressed to, and it did a good job of serving that purpose. So, kind of to, if I ever know how to turn off my screen share, kind of to summarize here, I do not believe that the Old Testament law should be implemented in modern society. I think that it has been obsolete for 2,000 years. But I also believe that during the time period that it was responding to, I think it would have been too much if it had been more, and if it had been harsher. I think that it was because their hearts were hard that Moses gave them this law, as the Bible says, and I think that they would have rejected it. I think that they would have not followed it, and I think the slaves would have suffered for the fact that they weren't getting the protections the Old Testament law does provide. And also I'll point out that the question is not whether or not it is the most moral possible ethical code. Personally, I believe that it is a very good ethical code. The question is whether it is immoral or unethical, not getting too much into the differences between those, because it seemed to trip us up earlier in the debate. And I think that there was sufficient reason to believe that these laws were moral in the way that they were manifesting in the culture. I think they were a good response. I think that without these laws, people would have suffered, and I am glad that they were here. And, yeah. I'm done.
Well, thank you for that, Max. I'm sure that you guys are very excited to get into our question and answer period. I'm going to step back and just kind of let you guys go at it. Cash, since you presented first, would you like to offer the first question to Max?
Well, I would like to. Does it have to be in the form of a question, or I guess I need to address what Max said just a second ago, that I hadn't laid out a case for the ethics, which I think I did in my opening statement, because I said
Squeeze
that
the question thing at the end, and we'll count it as a question.
I didn't catch that, Max. Go ahead.
Just squeeze a little question statement at the end of your rant, and we'll count it as a question. But condensed relatively.
Well, the bottom line is I would want to ask. Exodus 21 is where I would find it hard for anyone to honestly defend this or try to manipulate it into something that it isn't. And I would pose my question this way. In Exodus 21, it says that and I'm sure you're familiar, in verse 2, if thou buyest a Hebrew servant 6 years, he's got to serve you, and then in the 7th he shall go out free. Okay? But if he were married, then his wife shall go out with him. But if the master has given him a wife, which you did some fancy stuff with that, talking about like a concubine type deal, or a servant, a maidservant, and she has borne him a son or daughter, the wife and her children shall be her master, and he shall go out by himself. And if the servant shall plainly say, I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not go out free, then they put an awl through his ear, some kind of huge, wooden stake, basically. So my question would be is, how do you manipulate that? How do you word salad that into that's okay slavery?
Okay, good question. In this case, well, again, I don't think that any slavery is okay. I think that all of this, everything that everyone did, was wrong. If we're asking how I believe that this law was a correct response to the time period, I've defended a lot of it in a general sense, so I'm just going to explain how it fits into it in a more specific sense. First, the argument that I made earlier was that the Hebrew indicates that this is actually a heathen bondmaid that is given to a man who is already married, because he, has to be, you cannot push a heathen bondmaid on a man who is not married in Hebrew law. So this woman is not a Hebrew, and she's treated as a non-Hebrew slave, and under the conditions that I set out in my slideshow. And I justified why a non-Hebrew slave would be treated worse than a Hebrew slave, and a non-Hebrew slave does, in fact, not necessarily get released unless they walk out the door or get injured. However, with the children, I unfortunately don't recall whether or not they are considered Hebrews or not, but I do know two things. One, chances are typically when it comes to child slaves, they get released upon puberty. Now, I'd have to do a little bit more research specifically into this case to figure out whether it applies here or not, because Hebrew law is very nuanced, in case you couldn't tell from my spiel. But it is likely that they would be released during puberty, which, by the way, the Hebrews defined puberty as having two pubic hairs, which I think is kind of a bizarre way to interpret having puberty, but that's how they measured it as having happened. Worth noting. So I think that this all kind of fits nicely into the framework that I gave earlier in terms of the Hebrew is released. He is only treated in the way that he's described later if he decides to abandon his wife or children to be with a heathen bondmaid, which isn't super cool. But yeah, the reason why the wife is still with him is for the reasons I gave in the slideshow regarding why a heathen would be treated less than a Hebrew. Heathen Hebrew, it sounds all... And the children, I don't know what happens to them because I'd have to do more research on that topic. So yeah.
Do you have a question
now?
for Kat?
What's that?
I have a question now, right? I think so.
Yep, it's your turn to ask the question.
Okay. I should have been thinking of one. But do you think, having said what I've said, this is just a curious thing, I guess, because I don't have like a more debate-oriented question. Do you think that it is possible that, while it wasn't necessarily good for today, and while slavery and rape are evil, that the Old Testament law could have had a generally positive impact on the society to which it was given?
Absolutely not. And my answer would be, if you take, I think it's the Vedics, and I think there's another community that existed with morals and higher moral standards. They had rules of law prior to these Jewish laws. And so, unless you're one of those young Earth creationists.
No, sir.
Okay. So, well, that makes me feel better about you, Max. You're back on the Christmas list. So I don't think that it was good. I don't think so. I think if God is given an opportunity to pass down rules of law, then he should give moral laws that should be, not only is it real important that you not sleep with someone of the same sex, and not only is it real important that you not pick up sticks on the Sabbath, but it's also real important that you don't own another human being. That seems to be common sense to me. I don't know how to wrap my head around it any other way.
Okay. I feel you. Can I
Yeah, go
the
ahead.
Q&A is kind of falling apart, so I'm just going to go ahead and respond. So a few things that I want to say is, first off, like, the Hebrews did have a lot of really good things going in their law that others did not. For example, they were one of the first societies to institute welfare for the poor, which isn't related to the current discussion, but it wasn't like, whether or not, let's set aside the whole God issue and the whole religion issue and just look at it from a historical perspective. One of the main points I want to communicate is this was not a bunch of evil barbarians trying to do, think of horrible things to justify slavery and rape. Like, that's not what the laws are. They're protections. And I think intrinsic not only to the Christian worldview, but also to the ancient Jewish perspective on this, from shortly after the time these laws were all kind of collected, is that, whether or not we agree or disagree that things could have done better, is that they were a response to the time, and that had they been harsher, they would have been ignored. And I think that it's a really tough thing to prove or disprove, obviously. But I also think, while I do believe that God played a role in these things coming down, I don't think whether or not we can demonstrate them to be God-given or whether or not they are held to a God standard necessarily has an impact on whether or not we can call them immoral. You know what I mean? I think that a thing can be, not ideal, although I do think that it is very good. This is just me entering into hypothetical zone. I do think a thing can be not ideal without necessarily being optimal in what you would picture a deity to accomplish. Does that make sense? Yeah, I'm just opening up now, not like, yeah. Oh, one more thing. So just so we're clear, you don't think that the society that the Old Testament law was given to was better because of these protections. You think that they were worse as a result of these protections.
Yes, I believe it gave men the ability to act in a way that served themselves the most, and it gave most power to the religious leaders. So, 613 laws. many of which carried a death sentence. You mentioned earlier that many, it was really hard to get killed for anything except picking up sticks on the Sunday. That one is a definite, and we know this because Moses didn't really want to, or we get the impression he didn't want to when he was brought the man who was found to be picking up sticks, and Moses goes to the Lord and says, what do? We found him picking up sticks, and the Lord says, kill the son of a bitch.
Yeah.
Hellfire. How do you justify that? And
well, that's a little bit off topic, and I haven't actually. I'd have to look at the passages that you're referencing and discuss it a little bit more. I would like to have you on a future show to discuss the Styx verse and other related passages. I think that would be interesting. Maybe more of a dialogue.
No, I wasn't trying to sidetrack you, Max, because you brought it up. You brought up the fact.
No, I absolutely understand. I'm just pointing out that it's in general. I am the sort of person who doesn't like to respond to things in such a big book unless I am, have recently read over it and researched it and I'm ready to go. I prepare a lot before I jump into that kind of discussion because there is a lot of nuance.
Let me say something to that point.
Yeah. Go ahead.
The fact that it has to be done that way, the fact that the God, the all-powerful, all-knowing God, would have his teachings would have to be, they're so nuanced that it requires the mental gymnastics of a team of apologists is beyond mind-blowing.
The Old Testament law is not a moral system. It's not a
exactly.
It's a legal system. It is how this country governed itself. And I don't know why or how you would make a legal system for a country that everyone could understand in a sentence. America doesn't function that way. It's not a weakness in our legal system. I don't think it's a weakness in the Hebrew legal system. I think that if you want to understand laws that were put down for a society 2,500 years ago, you should at least expect to work at least as hard as people have to work to understand the laws of the time period and place they actually live in, and then a little bit more to understand 2,500 years worth of differences. Even though it was shortly afterwards, we read the New Testament, and it's a lot easier for us to interpret, to look at, because these guys were, Greco-Roman, Proto-Western guys who kind of were our ideological predecessors in a lot of ways, and they thought about things a lot of the way that we do, but the Hebrews didn't. And so I think, I don't think it's a weakness on the part of Old Testament law that it's tougher to understand in the sense that you're describing. I don't think it's a strength. I think it's what you would expect from what it is.
Wow, that was certainly something else. I have to say, we ran over our time there for the question and answer period, but I kind of let that slide because you guys were getting into it and I was really interested. So now we are going to be moving to our conclusionary remarks. Cash, if you would like to offer any sort of conclusionary thoughts, you have 5 minutes to do so.
I could almost read my opening statement again because it is mental gymnastics to me. It is all semantics, word games, playing. It's the clusterfuck that is word salads. It's let me try to manipulate the other text to fit and explain why this is horrible. What Max did just a second ago was saying, well, it was a good system of law. Well, if you take those 613 laws, the no eating shrimp and all the bullshit, the menagerie of bullshit, and you go, okay, well, why didn't we hit on child abuse? Why didn't we hit on the abuse of women? Why were women not given equal rights then? Why has today's society superseded, its morals have superseded that of the Bible by leaps and bounds? And not with the help of a God. Because if we wanted to do a Sarah Palin turnaround or a Michelle Bachmann turnaround or Rick Perry, we could. And we'd have slaves again, and we'd have a reason, an excuse, and a right to do it because it's biblical. We'd have a right to go out and take slaves from neighboring countries like it gives us permission in, I think it's Deuteronomy, I'm not positive. It gives us permission to go get these people, these slaves, and bring them in. And they never are freed. It says that in the Bible. And they can be passed down as inheritance. These people, we're told how to beat them. We've done better than that. Our morals supersede any of the gods that I'm familiar with, and what we end up with is someone trying to defend a decayed, immoral, atrocious, horrific set of ethics or morals that we shouldn't even attempt to. And if Max was the only person on the planet that was defending it, he'd be locked up. He'd be considered crazy. But he's got 2 billion friends who all believe that, oh, that was a different time back then. Slaves, it was a good thing back then, and it was a nice slavery system. It's bullshit. It's kind of like we defend slavery in the United States and we defend the inequality we gave to women. We've come past that. But we owned up to it. We said, yeah, we fucked up. But the Bible doesn't. The Bible doesn't ever mention it. God doesn't come back. He doesn't give new revelation. He gives us people like Max who are going to defend the shit out of it, try to manipulate it into something we can all go, okay, that's easier to swallow. I didn't realize it was raped in that way. That's all I got.
Cool. I have a few things to say. The first is that regulation is not encouragement. We can look at that all over the place. Just because, America, we have a minimum wage, that doesn't mean we are encouraging companies to pay people the minimum wage. In fact, when companies pay people the minimum wage, we kind of scowl upon it, right? We set a minimum bar because we think that if we raised it, go talk to, these fiscal conservatives who have a huge problem with raising the minimum wage. Their issue isn't that they think people should be paid dirt. Their issue is that they think increasing it would break the system. And that means, that does not mean that the regulation is encouraging it. And I feel like by equating Old Testament regulation of slavery and regulation of with encouragement of slavery, I think that is wrong. And I think it's I think it is not an accurate description of what's going on. I also think dang it, there's something else I was going to say. I think that there is also this idea that ancient people were fundamentally different from us, that they were evil, that they were trying to set up these laws with intent to hurt more people or to cause more problems. And if we look at the Old Testament law, that's simply not true. Even if it was not the work of a deity, if we study it and we read it, it comes across as the work of people who were doing their best and were trying to make the world they lived in better. And I think that portraying that as being pro-rape is wrong. I also want to point out, we have not passed biblical morality necessarily, because the Old Testament law is not morality. It is a legal system for a country that does not exist anymore. And the New Testament explicitly says on multiple occasions, the entire book of Galatians is about this. And I posted a slide earlier that had all the arguments. We are not bound by Old Testament law, since the coming of Christ. Moreover, before that, the Hebrews don't consider non-Hebrews to be bound by Old Testament law because it's a legal system. And so, while I can understand why a 21st century American mind would look at this and have cause for concern because of how alien the world that the authors must have lived in to think that these were laws that were good. I also think that from their perspective it was good, and I think that for their time period it was good. I think that it improved things, and I also think that there is a reason that if you look at the people to this day who believe they are bound by Old Testament law, they are consistently the people who you see winning Nobel Prizes the most, disproportionately, and the people you see, activists like modern Jews, the people who follow this stuff, are not raping people in huge amounts and justifying with the Old Testament. They're not enslaving people, and it's not because the Old Testament encourages it and they're ignoring it. It's because the Old Testament regulates it, and the message is more important than the words. Done. Oh, yeah. Done.
Well, I have to thank both of tonight's participants for coming out and debating. That was certainly a very good way to wrap up tonight's episode of A Debate Show Without an Interesting Name. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the page, Atheist Analysis. Don't forget to go over to @SWAIN and like, comment, and give us your thoughts. We're all very interested to hear what everyone has to say about this. Make sure you also check out Ash on Atheist on Air. And with that, I would like to thank both of tonight's participants. I think it was really an enlightening experience. I know I certainly learned a lot. Thank you again.
Thank you. Are we doing a Q&A with any of the people listening?
I don't think so. Is that in the thing?
That's why I asked at the beginning.
I don't think so. No.
All right.
Okay. Well, I'm going to stop the broadcast. Thank you again.